Hello again, it's Noob, and yes, you did read the title right. This is a video about why you shouldn't pick locks. But it isn't a clickbaity title, it's a genuine exploration of reasons why it's risky picking some locks, especially if you don't know about the lock, and especially if that lock isn't yours. And I hope the examples I give here will resonate with you. Maybe it's happened to you yourself and you go, yeah, that's true. Also, I hope that for some of you, you might not know some of these risks about lockpicking. I guess the first reason why you shouldn't pick a lock is because it might be illegal to do so. When is picking a lock illegal? Well, usually when it's not your lock and you don't have permission to pick it, but it could also be to do with your locality. Some countries, especially Japan, really frown on lock picking tools. In fact, it's criminal to, I think, own them and pick locks in Japan. No doubt that in the many countries around the world, there'll be plenty of other countries which have different rules about either owning lock picks or picking locks. And certainly that could be a very, very good reason why you shouldn't pick a lock, in that it would be illegal and could get you in trouble. Irreparably damaging the warding inside keyways to the point where you might not even be able to use the key again. You've damaged it so much. What do I mean? Well, look at this keyway. You'll see that it isn't straight down. It has some shaping inside the keyway. This is called keyway warding. And on this relatively new Master Lock 3, you can see that this warding is nice and square. Now, I have a master lock I've probably used in hundreds of videos. Look at the warding here, how it's curved. Why? Well, I've been using a tension tool like this, and what happens is, slowly over time, you put lots of pressure on the warding, and after a while, you see how the tension tool will slip round. In the newer version, it doesn't slip round like that, no matter what I do, because the warding isn't damaged. Here is a side-by-side comparison of the newer Master Lock 3 and my old Master Lock 3, the well-picked one, and you can definitely see the damage done to the keyway. Now think of a more expensive, more complicated lock, a rarer one which could cost a lot of money, and you can see already the warding inside this keyway is extremely fancy and a lot more delicate, to the point where you can bend some of the warding in these fancier keyways, and it will not allow you to put the original key back in. So if you've got an expensive lock and you don't want to damage it, really take that care in your tension tool positioning. Don't apply too much tension to it and you might not damage your lock. Here is a scenario which is largely unavoidable if you don't know what's inside a lock, and generally happens with extremely cheaply made locks with very poor tolerances, and that is where one or more driver pins are too short. You can see here that this is 1, 2, 3, 4 drive pins, and there is another one, but it's below the shear line. I'll show you what that looks like when I put the key in. Here you go, you can see it, that driver pin is too short. Now you'd think that that doesn't happen, but it happens an awful lot, and this can be anything from a minor inconvenience to a lock where you can get inside to repair the damage that this might cause when you pick it. And you might say, what damage? And I'll show you in a second. But again, if this is a lock which you can't get inside of to repair, it could in fact stop the lock from working. So again, you might not want to pick it if you don't know what's inside. So what scenario am I talking about? And that is where you can damage the spring in the lock. Let me show you. I'll just quickly pick these and show you what a pick lock looks like and what happens when you turn it. So in this very real scenario, which has actually happened to me on locks I couldn't gut and I had to throw away thereafter, is this. I've picked the first 4 pins. I think I've picked the 5th one because the core can turn like this. It's ready to go, but what has actually happened is, because the driver pin's too short, the spring is actually blocking the keyway from turning only, not the driver pin, which means that it offers very little resistance, and this happens. There we go. Look at that spring. That now is possibly even wrapped around the inside of the core itself. Let's have a little gut and inspect the damage. Oh yeah, look at that. That is not something you want to see. Look at that spring all chewed up on the inside. And again, you can see how it's wrapped itself all the way around the core. Not pretty. That spring is now damaged, that pin chamber won't work, and therefore the key in this will not work either. Let me just tip out the pins, I'll show you what I mean. And I think you can see why that pin chamber now is damaged irreparably. Luckily, I can get inside this lock and I can just pull out the damaged spring and replace it with one I have. But if you're a new picker, you might not even have a spring to replace it. So yes, definitely something which is sometimes unavoidable, and for a lock which you value, something which you need to definitely consider, or one that's in use, definitely consider not picking. Rendering a lock inoperable with a key because you've broken a tool off in it. Now imagine a scenario where I'm picking a lock that is in use, and maybe I just want to practice on it. Maybe I've got my confidence up and I just want to see if I can pick the lock. And then the worst thing happens, I put a bit too much pressure on and oh no, how do I get that out? So I might be trying to get in there with tweezers or another lockpick to try and get it out, and I might just force it into the lock more. Imagine now I can't use my key in the lock. Maybe the lock can't be locked or it can't be opened. Maybe I'm in a shared house. This is another good example of why you might not want to be picking locks that you rely on or that are in use, and particularly ones you don't own. Now, do tools break that often? No, not good quality ones from top brands, certainly not. But they do break eventually. Metal fatigues and they can snap, and you certainly don't want them to snap in a lock that you really, really need to open with a key. Otherwise, you're going to have a very embarrassing call to a locksmith and have to explain what you were doing. So I've actually heard of this happening, and therefore it's a very real reason not to pick a lock, and a very real scenario where you might want to pick a lock in your place of residence. Maybe you even want to pick a lock which you find in your own flat that you are renting. And by that, you probably don't own the lock, and therefore you probably shouldn't be picking it. Nevertheless, you think, what's the harm? And you give it a rake, and I made this lock particularly easy to rake, so let's give that a go. There we go, got it open. And of course, because you opened it so far, you think I might as well open the door up, so you keep turning the core until, oh, did you hear that? Something just dropped out of the back of this lock, which is at an angle. Well, let me grab that and tip out anything else that's in here. Yeah, look at that. What those are master wafers. These are designed so that they can sit above key pins or drive pins. I think there's another one actually here, just in my hand. And they allow more than one key to work in the same lock. So maybe the manager needs access to somewhere, or cleaners need access, and they all have different keys. If you pick a lock and you turn it around all the way so that this fat piece at the bottom of the keyway is at the top, thin wafers like this can actually spill out if they're installed. Normally they're held in by the key. You can see there how the flat bottom of the key would hold those wafers into the Bible. Without the key, you've left a big open gap and they can drop out. This would essentially mean that your key may or may not work, but certainly somebody else's key won't in this situation, and you'd probably have to have a very, very embarrassing conversation with the owner of that lock and possibly a locksmith after. So yeah, not good. If you don't know what's inside the lock, you probably shouldn't be picking it. You can risk wearing down pins to the point where the original key won't work, and that could matter if you're picking a lock that you actually use and you rely on, which is definitely not recommended. Just have a look, for example, at this key. This is an example of Keywear, where the key is worn down so much through many years of being put in and out of the lock. Compare that to a key which hasn't been used that much on a lock, and you can see the wild difference between how sharp this key is to how round this is. Why am I showing you that when I'm talking about pin wear? Well, think about a steel key like this wearing against brass pins in a lock. You're going to have wear on the pins and the lock happening. Sometimes to the point where the key no longer works. In this lock it does, but sometimes it doesn't. It's very, very unlikely you're going to damage a lock to the point where the original key won't work, but imagine if you just tipped it over the edge, that the pin was already worn, and by using heavy scrubbing or raking, you'd just damage it. Now, let's just have a look, for example. The damage on this probably won't be so high, but I picked this lock hundreds of times, and I'm sure we'll see and I've never really used a key in it, so anything in here that we do see damage-wise will be due to picking. And again, it could matter if you just don't want to damage your locks, but it's a risk that you have to take when you pick locks. You have to accept that there will be some wear. So here we are. These are the key pins from that lock I had earlier, and at first glance they might not seem particularly worn, but let's just zoom in a little bit more on this, and you can see how there is a groove around the front edge facing the camera. I don't know whether you can see that. It's a little line. That's where the pins will align to when you're raking or picking a lock, and the deeper the grooves, the more that it's likely to follow the pick when the pick is inserted. So they will orientate a certain way and they will score. Let's compare that to a brand new pin, and yes, the tip of the pin, the shape is slightly different, but nevertheless is a brand new pin, and just look how smooth and round the tips are. Like I said, it's very unlikely that you'll pick a lock enough that you cause a major failure in the lock, but it's certainly something worth considering with older locks and locks in use, where you just want to make sure that you're not increasing the wear of that lock overly by doing heavy picking and raking. Another good reason not to pick a lock is where you do not know what is inside the lock and do not know how it's going to behave when you pick it. One well-known example is plastic lotto padlocks, these lockout locks, which are fully sealed units, and you can't get in there to gut the lock. Inside is usually a core much like this, and most of these types of locks don't allow the core to turn past a certain point, and even if you pick it, there is usually cuts in the keyway so that a tension tool or key has a natural stop point. However, that isn't always the case, and you can overturn them. What would happen if you overturn them? Well, these key pins, which normally reside here, can spill out of the holes which are used as part of the manufacturing process at the bottom. What would that do? Well, it would essentially make this lock into a rattle, and it would mean that you couldn't use the key or pick it ever again unless you were to prise the lock apart, fix it, and then glue it back together. A rather sad real life example of this is this Keyzo 10, which I had picked, and I accidentally over rotated it, and now I can't put a key in one side. What has happened? Well, if you look at the key, you'll see that there are multiple bittings on multiple sides. That means that there are 3 different places where the key pins are, and when I picked it, what has happened is that as I've turned it past the position that I should have done, it's picked up probably a key pin or a driver pin from another chamber, which has caused it all to jam up inside and means I can't get the key in. I can't even force the key in. There's just not enough space anymore. So essentially I've destroyed one half of this very, very lovely lock. This one is slightly unusual, but happens to me more than I like, and this is damaging the actual body of the lock. Does it really make a difference? Well, not massively, but if you're a collector like me and you just don't want to damage your locks, then yes, it's really annoying. So aside from the markings up here, which happens where you put keys in, as well as tension tools where the bow actually just butts up against the or the shoulder of the key butts up against the lock itself, that's sort of normal wear and tear. But look down here, can you see this groove there? That is not a groove made by the key, that's a groove made by the insertion of tension tools and heavy tension. So I think I've been tensioning it sort of this way around. How can you get around that? Well, you can use maybe a smaller, thinner pick to put at the bottom of a lock to protect the actual lock body. Like I said, it's more aesthetics than anything else, but certainly if you've got an expensive and relatively rare lock, a bit like this one, you don't want that to happen. It's a consideration that you may not have thought of. Damaging the core of the lock. Now, this is something which happens more for cheap cast locks like this. And if you look at the keyway, apart from it looking a bit gnarled, you might not think too much of it, but look a bit closer where I've actually put this under too much tension using a heavy tensioner, and you can see there, can you see? There's an actual crack in the core. Now, I think this reason to be careful with a lock is probably a bit of a stretch, because it only really happens with really, really cheap locks. But again, if you had a fragile antique lock that you're using and you wanted to keep it in nice condition, you probably don't want to put too much tension on it, because some locks can be prone to cracking, especially ones which have these skeletonized cores, which is quite common again in cheap Chinese made locks. This one you can see into, but many you can't. So it is definitely worth considering how much tension you put on cheaper or older locks. And I guess the only way around that is, if you can't use lighter tension, is probably, again, don't risk damaging a lock that you don't want to damage. Another reason why you might not want to pick a lock is for when you're going to pick a lock for the express purposes of gutting it, exploring it, maybe progressively pinning it, maybe repinning it, who knows. If you are a lock picker and you pick a lot of locks, you will be disassembling a lot of locks at some point. However, I do understand that this is more about the issues with gutting locks rather than picking locks, so I'll just give this one very important example, and that is where you don't know what's going on inside and you risk damaging the lock when you gut it. In this particular example, this is because it's got a skeletonized core. Look at this, it's got gaps all the way along the plug. Most plugs in locks are completely solid. In this, if we take a look, you'll see that it's been cut away to save metal. That metal will be milled out and recycled. And you can see here that these slithers of metal which are left align with the pin chambers, so you could pick this lock and allow the core to turn with no troubles. Where the troubles actually occur is where you try to gut the lock without using a shim, or sometimes even when you do use a shim, to protect the driver pins from interacting with the core itself. Like I said, if you don't know what's going on the inside, you might not know the trap. And you can see how here we've already had an accident trying to gut this. One of the pins has fallen into these cutaways in the chambers. How's that happened? Well, this side is picked, and say you are using a follower through the lock, but you haven't put a shim in place, so you're pushing, that will push this plug out. And what will happen, if I can get it to pull out enough, is these pins, oh, there you go, will fall into those spaces in the plug itself, or the core. And that means that I won't be able to pull it out any further. I won't be able to push it, I won't be able to rotate it, or definitely won't be able to put a key in there. This whole thing is completely seized up now. Now, I might be able to rescue this one by popping off this base plate. It's only press fit, and repinning it from the underside, and that's perfectly doable. But for a lot of locks where it isn't like this, and it's in a closed surrounding, and you might just have to throw the whole thing away. It might just be completely irreparable. So yes, whilst this is an example about gutting rather than picking a lock. If you're picking a lock to gut it and you don't know what's going on inside, I would suggest you do your research first. And the final reason why you shouldn't pick a lock is because picking locks is addictive. If you start picking locks, you'll start wanting to pick more locks. You'll start to want to pick more exotic locks, more expensive locks. You'll be buying locks. You'll be buying different equipment to pick different locks. It goes on and on and on. And yeah, clearly, it's a fantastic hobby with a fantastic community, and there's so much room to learn in this hobby. But yep, it is addictive, and that might be a good enough reason for you not to start. Although, nah, ignore that. It's such a good hobby. You really have to get on with lockpicking. It's brilliant fun. Anyway, so that is my top 10 list of reasons why you shouldn't pick a lock. Clearly there are many pitfalls to lockpicking, some unseens and unknowns, which really just shows there is a risk to picking a lock, or at least many locks, and you either accept that risk or you mitigate it by learning as much about the lock as you can before you interact with it, pick it, all those kind of things. With legal considerations, and especially locks which you don't own, it may be in a rented property or something like that. You really just want to make sure you understand the law in your locality, and make sure really just don't pick locks that you rely on or that are in use, and especially ones you don't own. That's why those are standard locksport tenets. Really, it's because you don't know what's going on inside a lock sometimes, even if you're familiar with the lock, and you could end up doing something you deeply regret afterwards. Anyway, I really hope you enjoyed that video. I really enjoyed making it. If you like the video, please leave a like. If you have a comment, if there's something you think I've missed or you disagree with, just let me know below. I do read all the comments and I reply to as many as I can. And of course, if you haven't subscribed to the channel and want to see more content like this, please consider subscribing. It really helps the channel out. And I'll see you all next time.